All right, welcome back to ABA exam review and the continuation of our RBT practice exam series, where we're going through another set of questions together and breaking them down. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Please like and subscribe. Check out btexamreview.com for all of our study materials, including our combo pack. When you pass your exam, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. Let's get going. When collecting data, you notice a client engages in a brief, low-intensity hand flap every time you present an instruction. This behavior is not interfering with the session, and your supervisor has not targeted it for reduction. To ensure your data collection is accurate, you should do what? Now remember, as the technician, your primary role is implementation of the plan and then collection of that data. In this case, you notice a new behavior occurring. And when you work directly with clients, you are going to see new behaviors all of the time. What we have to remember is we have a limited amount of time, a limited amount of resources, and a lot to work on. And so realistically, we can't target every single behavior possible. Additionally, in this case, it's a brief low-intensity flap that is not interfering with your session. In other words, it is a behavior that you notice, but it's not interfering with your session at all, and it's not in the current plan. As a technician, what is your best course of action to make sure your data collection remains accurate? A, record it, the hand flapping, on your data sheet as it's a behavior you observed. You should not do that. You need to use the data sheet as is designed. So however you're currently taking data on the target behavior, that's how you need to continue taking data on that same target behavior. B, ignore it as it's not a target behavior. Well, we don't want to just ignore it altogether. Maybe in the moment, we don't want to acknowledge it because we don't want to, let's say, provide attention on accident and reinforce it. But instead of ignoring it, we can inform your supervisor of the observed behavior during your next conversation. Now, if you've been following me for a while, watching my videos for a while, you'll notice that in most cases, more often than not, when it comes to a situation of communication, the first step is always talk to the supervisor, because that's what's taught and that's what's encouraged by coursework and by our task list. Open communication with the supervisor. They're ultimately the decision maker and ultimately the person who should give you guidance on where to go from here. And then D, immediately start collecting frequency data on the hand flap. It's not a target behavior. It's not in the behavior plan. You are not the one designing the interventions. No need to start taking data needlessly. So what should you do? You should inform your supervisor of the observed behavior during your next conversation. A gardener is teaching a new assistant how to repot a plant. The gardener provides step-by-step instructions and prompts the assistant through the entire sequence. Get pot, add soil, place plant, add more soil, water. They assist the assistant as needed for each step until the assistant can do the whole process independently. This teaching method is most an example of what? So we have step-by-step instructions, and then we have this chain. So immediately as we're reading this question, and we're thinking about what are we doing, what kind of information are we gathering, it looks like a task chain question, right? So when it asks about the teaching method, we can assume it's a task chain based on this information. Now, then we have to ask ourselves, what kind of task chain? The gardener is providing these step-by-step instructions and prompts throughout the entire sequence. And they're assisting until the assistant can do the whole process independently. So what separates forward chaining, backwards chaining, and total task chaining? Well, it is where we start the teaching. With forward chaining, we're starting on step one. We're teaching from the beginning, teaching one step at a time until they get that step, then the second step, and then the third step, so on. Backwards chaining is the opposite. Last step, second to last step. Total task chaining, we're teaching and going through the entire sequence every single time. With total task chaining, you're going through the sequence and only providing assistance as necessary. With forward chaining, you're teaching that first step and then prompting through the rest. Then the first and second, prompting through the rest. Backwards, it's the opposite. Total task, we're going through that entire sequence every time until they can do the whole process independently. Notice they're not stopping at a certain point in the beginning or at the end and teaching that individual step. They're just going through the process and then working on the steps as needed. A client has a behavior reduction plan for hitting, which is maintained by attention. The plan instructs you to implement extinction by ignoring all instances of hitting and also provide enthusiastic praise when the client uses their communication device to request attention appropriately. The most important aspect of implementing this plan is what? Now, this is a good teaching question. One, the question is asking about the most important aspect. So it's not saying not all the aspects, or they're not saying some aspects aren't important. They're asking about the most important. And we're always, regardless, looking for the best answer. So if we have a behavior reduction plan for hitting, which is maintained by attention, and you're supposed to implement extinction and then also praise a replacement behavior, what's going to be the most important aspect of this extinction and differential reinforcement procedure? A, ensuring the client always receives a tangible item after using their communication device. Is there anywhere in the question that talks about tangible? No, they want, or your supervisor wants you to provide praise. So we've got to read carefully. A, does not fit within the information given to us. B, consistently withholding all attention when hitting occurs. That would be extinction. That would be ignoring all instances of hitting. Extinction is number one. When you have an extinction procedure, it is the number one priority to implement extinction 100% of the time or as close to as possible. If we are not consistent with extinction, it can only make things worse. So if you have extinction written into a plan, the most important thing of that plan is going to be extinction, other than obviously doing no harm and keeping the client safe. C, because we read all of our answer choices, immediately putting the client in timeout after each instance of hitting. There is no punishment written into this plan as far as we know, so C is out. D, informing the client that hitting is a bad behavior. You can tell the client that they should not be hitting. It is not a problem to tell the client what the intervention is. In fact, it is encouraged. Let them know what we're going to be doing. But given this information, we have an extinction procedure. That is going to be the most important piece, specifically consistently implementing that extinction procedure. You're collecting data on a client's hitting behavior. The behavior intervention plan specifies that you are to collect data on the number of times hitting occurs within each 15-minute interval. You record a tally mark every time hitting happens. What type of measurement are you primarily using? Now, this was a little tricky because in the past we've talked about when we read measurement questions and we see this word interval, we should think discontinuous. But we still have to read carefully, okay? The intervention plan wants you to collect data on the number of times hitting occurs within the interval. So it's not saying use each interval and then record partial data or whole data. It's asking for the number of times hitting occurs. And you are recording every time hitting happens. So are you discontinuously measuring or continuously? Well, if you're recording every single behavior, you're continuously measuring. So just because that word interval is in there, we've got to read a little more closely and look at this idea that we are actually recording every time hitting happens. And since we're taking account, what are we using? Well, we're not using duration because duration is a length of time. We're using frequency, the frequency of hitting in those intervals. Now, latency, of course, is the time in between the SD and a response, which is not what we're using. Momentary time sampling would be at the end of the interval. We're looking at the whole interval, the entire interval, the 15 minutes, and taking frequency data on when the hitting occurs. So yes, typically when you're reading a measurement question and you read about intervals, you're thinking discontinuous. But this is a good example of why you still need to read carefully and actually take the exam and not just be a rote test taker and not critically think. We are taking frequency data inside this interval. We're continuously measuring across 15 minutes. A coach wants players to hustle during practice. He begins giving verbal praise after a player hustles, but only after a random number of plays. Some get praised after 2 plays, others after 5. Players begin hustling more consistently. What schedule is being used? So we have basic reinforcement schedule question here, and our basic schedules consist of fixed versus variable and ratio versus interval. Fixed means the reinforcement is delivered at the same point every time. Variable is on an average, or in this case, random. Ratio is about responses, interval is about time. So let's start with fixed first. Variable. Is this schedule changing or is it unchanging? Well, it's changing, right? It's a random number of plays, some after 2, some after 5, right? So we're not looking at a set number of plays. We're looking at a changing number or an average. Now we have to ask ourselves, is this based on a ratio schedule or an interval schedule? Because we know it's variable. Ratio is based on the number of responses. Interval is on time. We're looking at hustles. So if they hustle for 2 plays or hustle for 5, they're getting reinforced. Hustling is the response, and they've got to hustle a certain amount of time, a certain amount of times, right? So it's not about the length of time. It's about the number of hustle plays they make. So we're looking at a variable number of hustle responses, which would give us a variable ratio. Thanks for watching. Check out btexamreview.com. Please like and subscribe. When you pass your exam, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout-out. Work hard, study hard. See you soon.